Hello, everyone. Welcome to Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation and our weekly research seminar. My name is Harold Trinkunas. I'm the Deputy Director for the Center. It is a pleasure to welcome today David Sloss to present in our research seminar. Professor Sloss joins us from Santa Clara University. He is the John A. and Elizabeth H. Sutro Professor of Law, author of a number of books and edited volumes, including The Death of Treaty Supremacy and Tyrants on Twitter, Protecting Democracies from Information Warfare, which is forthcoming from Stanford University Press this April. This is the book he will be talking to us about today. His books have won prestigious awards from the American Society of International Law. And we should also mention that he has an extensive background in government service, having worked on issues related to arms control and nuclear proliferation. Before I turn it over to Professor Sloss, I mentioned that we have an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the talk by Professor Sloss. By custom, we usually encourage our junior fellows, our postdoctoral fellows to ask the first few questions. I will be moderating the Q&A. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of Zoom at any time during the presentation, and I will organize the Q&A discussion once Professor Sloss concludes his presentation. David, turning it over to you.
All right, thank you very much. And let me just say, it's really a pleasure to join you here today. I thank you for hosting me for this event, and I'm only sorry that we couldn't be in person, but you know, we're all getting used to adapting to changing public health circumstances. So we'll do the best we can with the situation we've got. So I'm talking to you, as Harold said, about my forthcoming book, Tyrants on Twitter. I just want to briefly summarize the sort of main claims in the book. So I sort of start with the assumption that we're in or entering into a new Cold War with China, and that Cold War, and Russia is really a part of it too here, but this involves competition in three different areas: military, economic, and competition in the information domain. We're really not going to win this conflict militarily for the same reason that we couldn't win the Cold War with the Soviet Union militarily, which was just too costly and expensive to engage in military conflict. Unlike the Cold War with the Soviet Union, we're unlikely to win this economically either, because China is much stronger economically than the Soviet Union ever was. So there's really a premium on competition in the information domain, partly because the other areas are areas where we're unlikely to sort of win this Cold War, and partly because of new technological developments making competition in the information domain much more significant than it was in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. So one of my main claims here is that the United States is effectively subsidizing Chinese and Russian information warfare on social media by granting Chinese and Russian agents essentially free and unrestricted access to US social media platforms. And I think this is a major strategic mistake, because those social media platforms have become very important tools or weapons in the information warfare domain. So my main policy proposal that I develop in the book is I argue that we should ban Chinese and Russian agents from US social media platforms. And I know that proposal is controversial. I'll come back and say more to defend that in a little bit. But just to sort of continue fleshing out the main argument here. Now, for some reason, I'm not, my screen is not working to advance the slides here. Hold on a second. There we go. So I argue that Chinese and Russian information warfare poses a significant threat to Western democracies and contributes to the problem that I call democratic decay. I'll say more about that in a minute, but basically, I think this phenomenon is probably now well known to most of the people in this audience, but what we've been seeing for approximately the last 10 years is a rise in the number of authoritarian states in the world and a decline in both the number and quality of democratic states in the world. And I think this is a significant problem, and information warfare is a major contributor to this problem. And so to reverse those trends, we really need to regulate social media to protect democracies from information warfare, particularly from Chinese and Russian information warfare. And that will require regulatory harmonization among the leading Western democracies. And I have some pretty concrete proposals for how that could be done. So I claim that the power to regulate social media, we really should be seeing in the current sort of environment as a strategic asset. And we're effectively squandering that strategic asset by failing to regulate social media, or at least failing to regulate it effectively. All right, so let me see a little bit more here about democratic decay. This chart presents a picture of sort of the decline of authoritarianism and the rise of democracy in the post-Cold War era, beginning in 1990 and continuing until 2006. So in the first sort of decade and a half of the post-Cold War era, we saw a dramatic decline in the percentage of states in the world that are authoritarian or autocratic, and a significant rise in the percentage of states in the world that qualify as democracies. But that trend has reversed since about 2009 or 2011, depending on which line you look at. The bottom line shows that the percentage of autocratic states in the world sort of hit bottom in 2011 and then has been steadily rising since then. The percentage of democracies in the world really peaked in 2009 and has been declining since then, although not in a straight line. And I think this is something we should be worried about, and we need to think about how to reverse these trends. And I think information warfare is a piece of this. Obviously, there's a lot of factors contributing to the decline of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism, but information warfare is an important piece of that. So what do I mean by information warfare? This Venn diagram basically gives you an idea of how I define information warfare. There are obviously other possible definitions, but I look at information warfare as the sort of intersection between two different areas. On the one side is foreign influence operations. Obviously, states have been conducting foreign influence operation for centuries. There's nothing new about foreign influence operations, but social media provides new and different kinds of opportunities for conducting foreign influence operations. And on the left side here, I have organized social media manipulation. I borrowed that term from Philip Howard, who's a scholar at Oxford, who directs the Oxford Internet Institute. Organized social media manipulation, a lot of that is sort of purely domestic, right? We see this in, election operations in the United States and other countries that, paid media consultants engage in organized social media manipulation to target domestic audiences for electoral purposes and maybe for other purposes. But information warfare is when basically actors are using social media, manipulating social media as part of a foreign influence operation. And we've seen both Russia and China engage in extensive information warfare activities over the past decade or so, Russia is probably more advanced than China in this area, but China is rapidly catching up to Russia in the scope and sophistication of its activities. So there's a great line I like from somebody who formerly worked on these issues on the National Security Council, who said, in this area, Russia is a hurricane and China is climate change. And what he meant by that is Russia's activities in the information warfare space are primarily sort of negative and destructive, whereas China really has a vision of a future international order that it is trying to create. It really wants to sort of replace the United States as the dominant force in the international order. And the process of trying to reshape that international order is going to be a sort of a slow and gradual process. But eventually, China's aim is to sort of realign the international order in a way that is more in line with authoritarian values and more hostile to the values of democracies, including democracy and individual freedom. So I just want to say a little bit separately about both Russia and China. In the book, there's lots more detail about what they're up to, and I can just give a little bit of a taste of it here in this presentation. But Russia, the leading example that I think everybody is familiar with is Russian interference in the 2016 US election. Robert Mueller, in his position as special counsel, provided a very detailed report documenting Russian activities here. There are a variety of other sources that one could look to to document Russian activities in the 2016 election, but he characterized Russian interference as sweeping and systematic, and provides lots and lots of detail to sort of back that up. And I draw on Mueller as well as other sources in my chapter on Russian interference in the US election. I also rely a lot on a book by a scholar at Penn, Kathleen Hall Jamieson, who did a detailed study of Russian interference and concluded that they may actually have swung the outcome in Trump's favor by influencing votes in 3 critical swing states, which are Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And again, it's hard to say definitively that were it not for Russian interference, that Clinton would have won that election. But there's at least a sort of a plausible argument that she fleshes out in great detail to support the proposition that were it not for Russian interference, Clinton would have won that election. But even if, Russia didn't influence the electoral outcome, it certainly had an impact in contributing to the loss of faith in democracy. And that in itself is a very significant harm, I would argue, even if they didn't really sort of turn the election in favor of Donald Trump. Now, I document in the book there are at least 20 other examples of Russian interference in elections in countries that are members of either the European Union or NATO or both. And clearly, Russia has had a goal of weakening both NATO and the European Union. And I think it's achieved at least a partial success there. This remains to be seen. And frankly, what happens in the coming weeks or months in Ukraine could have a big impact here. So we'll have to wait and see. But one of the things that Russia has done that has been influential has been supporting the rise of far-right parties in Europe. And there are a number of European countries where we've seen significant electoral gains for parties on the far right. And at least some of that is attributable to Russian interventions, which have supported those far-right parties, both through monetary support and through more sort of information warfare kinds of activities. All right, so I'm going to switch now to China and give you a sense of the scope of Chinese global information operations. So this chart lists 5 leading Chinese media companies, and it shows how many likes they have on Facebook in comparison to leading US media companies. And you can see that these 5 Chinese media companies, all of which have operations that are global in scope, have achieved far more likes on Facebook than any of the top US companies. So you can think about Chinese global information operations as sort of the Chinese equivalent of Voice of America. But Voice of America, during the Cold War was targeted primarily towards Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. These Chinese media companies are really conducting a global media operation to disseminate propaganda that basically supports or disseminates the Chinese view of global affairs. And they're reaching a much broader audience globally than the major US media companies. And this metric of likes on Facebook is just one of those metrics. But China has invested huge amounts of money over the last decade or so in developing a sort of a global media presence. And they've been very successful in developing that global presence and then using these Chinese media companies to sort of shape perceptions around the world on a variety of current events and world affairs in ways that sort of cultivate a sort of pro-China viewpoint. So that's one kind of way that China is using. And this is not sort of covert activity like Russia was engaged in the US elections. It's much more overt activity, although there is some covert activity involved here too. An example of more covert activity is the way that China uses WeChat to conduct surveillance and censorship in Western democracies. So WeChat is a Chinese social media platform, but it's really more than just a social media platform. It also, you can think of it as sort of Facebook and Amazon rolled into one, because people use WeChat a lot for buying and selling in addition to more traditional kind of social media functions. And WeChat has a huge presence in outside of China. So it's obviously got a ton of users inside China, but WeChat, the best estimate is there are about 240 million WeChat users outside of China. That's a pretty large number. And many of those are members of the Chinese diaspora in Western democracies. And so one of the things that's developed is that politicians in Western democracies, particularly those in jurisdictions where they have a sizable sort of Chinese American or Chinese Australian or Chinese Canadian, pick your country constituency, politicians in those Western democracies are using WeChat to communicate with their ethnic Chinese constituents. And China exercises control over that platform so that it can essentially monitor those communications and censor communications between Western politicians and their ethnic Chinese constituents. And again, in the book, I give pretty sort of detailed examples where we can see how this is working. But this is a pretty troubling trend about how China is, essentially intervening in, one of the core functions of democracy, which is how politicians communicate with their constituents, and using WeChat as a platform to interfere with that. And some recent reporting in the New York Times shows that China is actually getting pretty good at using Facebook and Twitter in similar ways, right? So this is, I think, a significant concern about Chinese intervention in democracies. And again, I could go into a lot more details here, but that gives you a little bit of a flavor of some of the kinds of concerns here. So before switching to more of a policy prescription, which I want to get to, I think there's an important general point here, which is that modern information warfare is really asymmetric. Russia and China can exploit information warfare both to undermine democracy in established democracies and also to promote autocracy in states that are sort of hybrid states that are neither solidly democratic nor solidly authoritarian. But we really cannot do to them what they do to us for two kinds of reasons. One is that they have closed information environments. So China has built the Great Firewall of China, which essentially makes it all but impossible for the US to really conduct information warfare within China. Russia is a little more open to outside intervention, but Russia in the last couple of years is doing more and more to sort of close off our access to being able to use social media to reach a Russian audience. And even to the extent that we could use social media or other kinds of media to reach domestic audiences within Russia and China, we can't really use that to influence elections because they don't conduct free and fair elections. So, we really, for both those reasons, cannot sort of do to them what they do to us. And that means information warfare is fundamentally asymmetric in important ways. And so we need to look at developing better defenses here. And in the time I have left, I want to just briefly outline my proposal for how we develop better defenses. So one of the core ideas is to shift the attack defense ratio here. Right now, we're basically relying on social media companies to provide defenses against fake accounts created by Chinese and Russian agents. And under the current environment, they can create easily 10 or more new fake accounts in less time and for less cost than it takes for the companies to block one of those fake accounts. So this means we don't have a good defense against fake accounts because it's just so easy and cheap for them to create new fake accounts. So part of my goal here is to shift the attack defense ratio and make it much more costly and time consuming for Chinese and Russian agents to create new fake accounts, and at the same time make it easier and cheaper for Western democracies to detect and block those fake accounts. And this, if we can do this, we can really have a much more robust defense against information warfare. And I believe we can do this. So my regulatory proposal basically consists of these elements that I've listed on the slide here. One is creating a new alliance for democracy, which would be an alliance among about 35 or 40 leading liberal democracies. We could do this by treaty, but I think it's probably better to do it through a more sort of informal agreement. The model I have in mind, which may be familiar to some of you, is something like the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which is a loose coalition of states that supply or export nuclear technology, who have come up with a set of guidelines that they all agree to follow. Those guidelines are codified in internationally agreed documents, but those documents don't take the form of a treaty, they're more informal, right? And then what the states would do would be adopt regulations to sort of harmonize their domestic regulations in a way that's consistent with international guidelines. So those domestic regulations would provide robust protection for free speech, for nationals of alliance member states. The centerpiece of this is there would be a ban on Chinese and Russian agents. So we would ban Chinese and Russian agents from major social media platforms, but have an exemption for what I'm calling benign state agents. There would be a disclaimer system. So let's say that Venezuela is not a member of the alliance, but somebody from Venezuela posts something on social media that is a commentary on elections in, say, France, which is a member of the alliance. That post on social media would be accompanied by a warning to warn the recipients of that message that the source of this message is someone who is a national of a non-member state. And that way we can be more intelligent consumers of election-related speech coming from countries that are not democracies, right? Venezuela being my example here. One of the more controversial aspects of my proposal is I would create a social media registration system. This is essential in order to make the ban effective. You can't really have an effective ban without a social media registration system. But the basic idea is that if I register for a social media account, I have to declare my nationality. And if I say I'm a US national, then I would provide some basic information to allow the US government to verify, yes, indeed, David Sloss is a US national. David Sloss is not a fictitious person, right? And basically anybody claiming to be a national of an alliance member state, their host government would have to verify that this is a real person and this person really is a Canadian national or a British national or whatever. And that's how we would make sure that Russian and Chinese agents are not able to register, say, as a US national or a British national. Because of concerns about privacy, I would include that individuals registering for accounts could essentially choose whether they want to have a private account or a public account. If they register a private account, they're exempt from these disclosure and registration requirements, but there are limits on their ability to communicate with a very large audience, okay? And my proposal includes relatively detailed safeguards to protect both data security and informational privacy. So a little more here on the registration system, and then I'll wrap up. I've already covered some of this. The registration system would require all social media users who want public accounts to register those public accounts, declare their nationality, and provide certain identifying information. And the home government would have to confirm that the declared nationality is true and accurate. I think I'll skip over this slide on costs and benefits and sort of leave this to question and answer, and happy to sort of take questions on that in the question and answer. And let me just say in conclusion that there is a bit of a paradox in what I'm proposing, because what I'm proposing is that we adopt what might seem to be illiberal policies in order to defend liberal values. But I don't actually see these as illiberal policies. I think they, critics will say that they're illiberal, but I think that the core value of sort of liberal political philosophy is liberal political philosophy favors open communication in order to promote a healthy democracy. And the problem we've got now is we're allowing open communication in a way that undermines healthy democracies. And I don't think liberal political philosophy requires us to take a commitment to open communication so far that we allow open communication to undermine healthy democracy. So I think if we understand sort of liberal political philosophy properly, Some government regulation of communication is necessary in order to protect democracy. And I think my proposal is defensible in terms of likely First Amendment objections, although it's a little hard to predict outcomes of First Amendment litigation. So let me stop there, and I'm going to turn off the screen share and open it up to comments and questions. And I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, David. We already have a lively number of questions in the Q&A. Just as a reminder, some people have been using chat to post questions. Please go over to the Q&A function on Zoom. That's what I can monitor more easily. And secondly, as a reminder, we actually allow our junior scholars, our fellows, our postdocs to ask the first couple questions. It's a CSEC tradition. So I'll take the first question, David, is from Josh Goldstein at CSEC. When talking about China's state media properties on Facebook, you said China is very successful at shaping global attitudes. How do you define success as it pertains to China's global messaging campaigns on social media? And what evidence suggests that China has been successful in shifting public opinion in other countries in ways that are politically important?
Okay, great. Thank you. That's a great question. So obviously it's hard to measure success, and one could quibble about what's the right measure. Certainly one measure is just how many people are they reaching? How big an audience are they reaching? And I think there's no question that China, through its various state media properties, is reaching a very large audience all over the world, right? Now, measuring how they shape perceptions and they shape opinion is harder, right? One way of looking at that is, well, you can look at public opinion polling data, to what extent do people in various countries have a favorable opinion of China? I think on that score, they're not doing that well, at least so far, right? There are lots of public opinion polling data showing that that people in a lot of different countries do not have a terribly favorable opinion of China. And so in that respect, they are maybe not succeeding. Obviously, there's a lot of variation by country there, and I can't give you detailed data about how that varies by country. But they are certainly sort of having an effect in shaping the narrative, right, on a variety of different issues, right? People in lots of different media markets all over the world are hearing the Chinese narrative because China is actually exerting influence over local TV and radio stations. China actually owns and operates local TV and radio stations in countries all over the world, and they're exercising a tremendous amount of influence over the ones that they own and operate. And even ones that they don't own and operate, they have partnership deals with various local media stations where those media stations are carrying Chinese propaganda, some of which is not being identified as Chinese propaganda at all. It's just coming across to local audiences as this is the news, right? So they're having a big impact in reaching a large audience, in shaping narratives, although in creating a favorable opinion of China, which is one of their key goals, I think the evidence is more mixed on that.
Thank you. Let me go now to Alan Weiner from Stanford Law. He says, hi, David, what are your criteria for determining who qualifies as a Russian or Chinese state agent? And secondly, can you comment on the constitutionality of a law categorically banning online expression on a US platform by Chinese and Russian state agents?
Okay, thank you, Alan. Those are both very good questions. So in terms of determining who is an agent, the way I try to do that operationally is by creating certain presumptions. And Alan, you're a lawyer, so you're very familiar with how presumptions are used in the law to sort of help answer questions that are very hard to answer on a factual basis. So the presumptions that I would create as part of the regulatory system is if someone is someone is based in China, they're presumptively a state agent, and they have the burden of proof of showing that they're not. If a Chinese national is based in the United States, they're presumptively not a state agent, and the burden of proof would be on the US government to show that they are, right? And that certainly doesn't answer all questions, and I actually would draw on principles of international law from the Articles of State Responsibility, which is a document produced by the International Law Commission that actually has some fairly detailed guidelines for determining who is or is not a state agent. So I would use that as sort of guidelines, but there would have to be factual determinations on a case-by-case basis, and you need some presumptions to facilitate making those factual determinations, right? So that's the basic answer on that question. On the constitutional question is complicated, but basically, US constitutional law makes clear that a foreign national outside of the United States is not protected by the Constitution. So a Chinese agent based in China, and let's assume we know who is or isn't a Chinese agent, right? Or even, it doesn't matter an agent, a Chinese national who's residing in China cannot claim First Amendment protections because the First Amendment just doesn't extend to them. On the other hand, I, as a consumer of information, do have a First Amendment right to hear what that Chinese national is saying, right? So a constitutional, if there's a rule that says basically Chinese and Russian agents are banned from US social media platforms, the person who would be in a position, the person who would be in a best position to raise a constitutional challenge to that would be a US citizen who says, hey, I want to hear what these Chinese and Russian agents are saying, right? I have an interest in hearing what they are saying. And that's one of the reasons I include in the system an exemption for benign state agents. I would essentially let the government determine who is a benign state agent, right? So the government might determine, for example, that China Global Television Network is a benign state agent, and US nationals actually have an interest in hearing what they have to say, right? But in that case, anything that is that they put out on social media would carry with it a label that says this person is a Chinese state agent, and that way at least we know that what we're receiving from that Chinese state agent is coming from a Chinese state agent, and that allows us to be better consumers of information. So the First Amendment here is going to involve, any First Amendment litigation is going to involve some balancing of competing interests. And I don't claim that the court would necessarily say what I'm proposing is constitutional, but I do claim that what I'm proposing is defensible under current First Amendment doctrine.
Thank you. Let me take a question now from Jill Hazelton at the Naval War College. She asks, in reference to the proposed alliance of democracies, who determines who is a benign state actor within those 35 to 40 states? It is possible that their interests will not align on who counts as benign. I would also parenthetically add, not everybody residing within those states, even if they are nationals of those states, might qualify as benign actors. And finally, if warning citizens of non-alliance states, citizens of alliance states about communications from citizens of non-alliance states create the risk of demonizing those other states, possibly to the detriment of international relations between alliance and non-alliance states.
Okay, great. So just to be clear, right? Let's say Switzerland is part of the alliance, right? Nobody's making a determination about whether a Swiss person is or is not a benign state agent, right? That Swiss person registers as a member of an alliance member state, and they essentially get unrestricted free speech on social media, right? Now, but the other angle of that question is, well, suppose that the Swiss government and the US government have a disagreement about whether, RT, right? RT is a big Russian state media property. RT stands for Russia Today, although it goes by RT. Maybe the Swiss government and the US government have a disagreement about whether RT counts as a benign state agent. Who gets to decide? My model here is something like the sort of sanctions committee set up under the Security Council for dealing with identifying who counts as a terrorist, right? And that sanctions committee set up by the Security Council is a multilateral body. We have representatives of different states, and those different states have to reach a collective determination. In that case, is who counts as a terrorist. So this would be a similar thing. You'd have a multilateral body that would look at that would be composed of members of probably not all the alliance member states, but representatives of some alliance member states who would be delegated the task of determining who is a benign state agent and who is not. I don't think it makes sense to leave that determination to one country, right? So they'd have to work out agreements on that. I'm sorry, there was another part of that question that I've now forgotten here, Harold, if you can remind me.
This was the question of whether designating or communicating that certain postings come from non-alliance members is, in a sense, demonizing these other countries or potentially creating friction in international relations among alliance and non-alliance states, or undesirable friction.
I think that is a legitimate concern, and I don't think I have a perfect answer to that question. What I would say, again, to go back to my Venezuela example, is the warning that would go with that is not, hey, this message is coming from somebody in Venezuela, and Venezuela is not a member of the alliance. That would be demonizing Venezuela, right? The warning would just say, this message is coming from somebody who is a citizen of or national of a state that is not a member of the alliance. So it wouldn't really be demonizing any particular state. It would just be giving a warning to, let's say, if it's about a US election, a warning to people in the United States that somebody from outside the United States is basically weighing in on US electoral issues here. And if that somebody from outside the United States is weighing in on US electoral issues, if it's a Canadian and Canada is a member of the alliance, there's no warning about Canadians. So it's not demonizing foreigners as a group, but it is providing warnings based on a determination of basically which states have good democratic credentials and which states do not.
Thank you, David. Let me actually turn one of my colleague Herb Lynn's questions into a two-finger on this very question that you just answered. He says, on what basis do you believe that identifying a speaker as, let's say, Russian or Chinese would make a difference in how content is perceived by an American listener?
Okay. First of all, remember, the basic proposal is we're going to ban, Chinese and Russian agents from social media platforms. So we're going to hear a lot less of, if this is actually implemented, we're going to see a lot less of Chinese and Russian speech on these platforms because a lot of those speakers are going to be banned from the platforms, right? But you're talking about now, well, some Chinese and Russians are not state agents, right? If they're not a state agent, they get to speak on the platforms. And if they are classified to be a benign state agent, they get to speak on these platforms too. And the only kind of speech that's going to get warnings is basically electoral speech. And I have a pretty narrow definition of what qualifies as electoral speech, okay? So the question is, if you're you're a US citizen, you are on, let's say, Facebook, and you're seeing somebody comment on some upcoming election, right? And make some comment about, let's say it's Biden v. Trump in 2024, right? And you're seeing some comment about Biden or Trump, in regards to the 2024 election, if that comes with some kind of warning that says, hey, this statement is being made by a Chinese national, or this statement is being made by a Russian national, some people are just going to blow right past that and say they don't care, right? But I think other people would take it with a grain of salt, right? And there's a lot of empirical research out there about the impact of these kinds of warnings. And I think, different people will present different views about the research, but what my takeaway from that empirical research is how the warning is presented matters, right? So the most effective warnings include both words and graphics. So I think you would have to give some thought into how you design the warnings, but I think graphics would be helpful here in getting people's attention. And even with words and graphics, right, which are the most effective kind of warnings, you can have some percentage of the population that just ignores it, but some percentage of the population that says, oh, well, that's interesting. I'm going to give less weight to this because I'm now being told that this is coming from a Chinese or Russian national, right? How much of the population is influenced by that? I don't know, hard to say, but I think it has some effect.
Thank you. I have a question here from Rob Denneberg. He says, potential free speech concerns aside, this proposal relies on social media companies to implement these changes. Given their hesitance to implement much less controversial and intrusive controls to date, is there anything in your proposal that gets at how you might get those companies to agree to such changes?
Well, ultimately, right, if it's codified in law, the social media companies don't have to agree. They're required by law to implement these kinds of changes, right? But of course, from a more sort of politically realistic standpoint, they have a lot of lobbying power, right? And if they lobby against the law, that reduces the chances that that law will actually be enacted, right? Now, let me qualify that. I will say that in a slightly different context, I've actually spent a lot of time in the last several months talking to people on Capitol Hill about a different kind of legislative proposal that I've got related to social media. I won't go into the details about that. And one of the really surprising things that somebody said to me, which was interesting, was, and this is a sort of a congressional staffer who's been working on the Hill for a long time, said, in the current environment, the best way to get Congress to pass something is to persuade them that Facebook hates it. Because if Facebook hates it, automatically a whole bunch of congressmen and senators will say, well, we hate Facebook, so that's a reason to do it, right? So my sort of initial intuition about how the lobbying would play out may actually be precisely backwards. And it may be that, and I actually think that, Facebook would hate this proposal, right? I don't think Facebook is going to like this proposal at all. But that may actually be a plus in terms of getting Congress to pass it. And if Congress does pass it, Facebook doesn't have much choice. They have to comply. Now, you might say, well, but the companies have a lot of ability to drag their feet and gum up the works. And if they, do that, it's not going to be very effective. I would include in that my proposed legislation here does include sanctions for companies that sort of willfully refuse to comply, right? That gives them some incentive to at least do what they are legally required to do in order to make the system work.
Thank you. We have a cluster of questions around issues related to censorship and registration of the individual accounts under your proposal, which I'm going to try to summarize. A number of different participants, Eric Sapp, Rob Denneberg, Ria Van Hurst. Basically, one is, isn't censorship contradictory to the idea of liberal democracy, and that in essentially a battle over information, you just let it play out and good information will drive out bad information? Again, I'm summarizing several different questions here.
Right.
And secondly, on the counterpart, isn't the requirement to register individual accounts run counter to the ability of people living within authoritarian regimes to be able to communicate anonymously and safely about political issues. So maybe two sides of a coin.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, let me take the second point first about this sort of registration requirement. And I think there are actually two aspects to that question. How does the registration requirement impact somebody in the United States? And, one of the more troubling examples, and then separately, how does the registration requirement impact somebody, say, in Saudi Arabia, right? One of the more sort of concerning examples of somebody in the United States is, that people have raised with me is, let's talk about somebody who's here illegally, right? An illegal immigrant who's been residing in the United States for a long time. If they register, don't they sort of expose themselves to government harassment, right? That person has like three different choices really under this system, right? They could register as a US national, in which case they would have to disclose information to the US government, and that might put them at risk, right? But they could also register, let's say they're originally from Guatemala, they can register as a Guatemalan national, and then assuming that Guatemala is not part of the alliance, they don't have to disclose any information at all to register as a Guatemalan national. They can just register as a Guatemalan national. And they still get basically unrestricted free speech, except that when they're commenting on US electoral issues or electoral issues in some other alliance member state, there's going to be disclaimers attached to that speech, right? But other than that, they can register as a Guatemalan national. They can actually give a fake identity, give a different name, because there's no verification associated with somebody who's registering as a Guatemalan national. Again, assuming Guatemala is not a member of the alliance, there's no verification of that nationality. There's no verification of their name. There's only a disclaimer requirement, right? Or alternatively, they can choose to set up a private account. And if they set up a private account, then basically the rule is they're limited in how many people their message can reach. So let's say we set a limit of 500 people. That means if I have a private account and I send a message out, right, it cannot be immediately transmitted to more than 500 people, but that still gives me lots of opportunity to communicate with friends and family over Facebook if that's what I want to do, right? When I'm communicating with friends and family, I don't need to get a message to 500 people. So there are various ways here to avoid that registration requirement. Now, consider the example of somebody in Saudi Arabia who's worried about monitoring by the Saudi government. Again, if they register as a Saudi national, they can use a fake name. And they can be protected from monitoring by the Saudi government, because the only people who are required to give their real name and identifying information are people who are registering as nationals of an alliance member state. And then even for those people, let's say I register with the US government and I have to give, my name, my social security number. Actually, I don't require social security number, but let's say passport number, something like that, right? The US government can verify that and say, yes, David Sloss really is a US national. But then if I want to use a pseudonym to speak to people on Twitter, I can use a pseudonym to speak to people on Twitter. And the only thing that's being done with that identifying information of name and passport number is the US government says, yes, there is a David Sloss who is a US national, has this passport number. Now we've confirmed that they can register as a US national. And then if all of my communication on Twitter is under a pseudonym, that's fine. They can't monitor my communication on Twitter because the government doesn't get to find out what pseudonym I'm using. Only Twitter knows what pseudonym I'm using, right? So there's a lot of protections in there that avoid sort of abuse of the registration system. And I could go on and that in more detail, but that's the basic picture. right? And again, there's a first part of that question, which now I lost in answering the second part, and I'm sorry about that.
Well, and I think, in fact, you addressed this issue of the tension between using a liberal means to protect liberal democracies towards the end of your slide. And if you wanted to add something on that now, but this comes back to this old debate that, good information will eventually win out over bad information. I personally have my doubts about that, but
yeah. So let me comment on that.
Point.
I think there is a lot of evidence out there. I mean, sure, this is the ideal. We want this to be true, right? This is a real problem with First Amendment doctrine, frankly, right? Current First Amendment doctrine is based on the premise that if you just allow everybody unrestricted free speech, the truth will win out, right? The problem is we now have a lot of empirical information that that's just not true, right? So if the goal of the First Amendment, and I think this is right, I think the goal of the First Amendment, or one goal of the First Amendment, is to have a information marketplace in which truth prevails over lies. I think what we've learned is the completely unrestricted free speech doesn't actually achieve that goal. If we want truth to prevail over lies in the marketplace of ideas, we need some government regulation to help ensure that truth really does prevail over lies in the marketplace of ideas. And I think there's just, loads of empirical data out there right now that suggest that's actually not happening in our current information environment. And so if that's our goal, we need some type of government regulation to help ensure that outcome. Now, I'll just add one other thing about that is what we don't want is the government determining what's true and what's false, right? I think we can all agree that would be antithetical to First Amendment values. And there's nothing in this proposal which suggests we're going to have the government in the position of determining what's true and what's false.
Thank you. It looks like we're almost out of time. Let me ask you one more question because it's related to a point you made just a few minutes ago. And this is from Gaurav Misra. Yes, this framework builds upon an assumption that we can reliably match a digital persona to a real-world person. My understanding is that this is incredibly difficult to do, especially in a privacy-preserving way. How big of a barrier do you consider this to be to your proposals?
Actually, there's nothing in here that requires us to match a digital persona to a real person, right? So if you think about the information that is available to a social media company when I create an account, say on Facebook, right? I would take that information and divide it between account registration information and operational information, right? The account registration information is just some very minimal data that again would include, and it varies a little bit, but just to take this example, my name, my birth date, and my passport number, right? And that account registration information goes to the government, so the government can say, yes, David Sloss is a real person, and he does have that birth date, and he does have that passport number, right? Once that happens, the government is out of the picture, and that account registration information is no longer used for anything else, right? And so then, now, Facebook is going to still have that account registration information, but I can set up an operational account so that in the operation of that account, there's nothing in the operation of that account that gives anybody else access to my name or my birth date or my passport number, right? I have an online persona that, as far as the rest of the world goes, is not linked to my personally identifiable information, right? So there, the online persona and the account registration information are sort of two separate things, and they actually don't have to be linked together at all for this system to work.
Well, thank you, David, for an extremely interesting session. We're just about out of time. So everyone, please join me in virtually thanking Professor David Sloss for extremely interesting talk as part of our CSAC's weekly research seminar. Thank you, David.
All right. Well, thank you all for really some great questions and a great conversation. Thank you.